Hey guys, welcome to Blackbird. We're going to change up our format with this series. This series is in honor of Black History Month, and we're calling it Black Profiles in American History. The videos will highlight different, often overlooked or little studied Black contributors to American history in big ways. So, it's me, Megan. Hey. Ashley is here, Mike is here, Elizabeth's here, Joe's here. And Micah, any housekeeping? Oh, Micah's muted. Micah, you're muted.
I should know better. So in the links below, there's for the Facebook group. You can hop on there and talk to Megan if you have any comments or questions. She's there for you.
I'm here for you. All right, so I'm gonna go today and we're gonna talk about Mary Richards. And some of you are like, who? Mary who? So she is more widely known by the name Mary Richards Bowser, 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 I was saying Bowser. So that's the name that she's sort of famously known by. But in doing my research, she was only known by that name for the Civil War, like, like from the start to the end. That was her name because she was married. Um, but like the majority of her life, she went by Mary Richards. So I thought that was interesting. So I got interested in her because Elizabeth's mom posted on my Facebook and she was like, a black woman, James Bond. And I thought that was really interesting. So I picked her to look at. Um, so because she was born into slavery, the first record of her doing anything was when she was 14. So based on that math, she was likely born in 1841, somewhere in or near Richmond, Virginia. Um, so as far as her parents go, there are several claims made by her who her parents were. Um, so the so she has said or has been quoted as saying in some of her speeches later in life that her father was Cuban Spaniard Negro and that her mom was white or that she never knew her parents. um, her heritage is unknown, but doing my research, she was very likely mulatto of mixed race. She was definitely and somewhere in my research they an article references her as a mulatto girl. So I thought that was interesting and maybe why a lot of the things that happened to her specifically were able to happen. So um, the other stories say that the family that owned her were the Van Lews, Lew, Van Lews, um, and they did have relatives who had the last name of Richards, and so she might have come from a relative to them, and that's where she got the name Richards. So I thought that was interesting. So anyway, so in like May of 1846, she was baptized Mary Janes at St. John's Church in Richmond, which is a white church and is very unlike even prominent rich white families didn't do that. So it's clear sort of from the beginning that the Van Loos treat her differently than they treat any of their other servants because there are records of them baptizing their other slaves at the American Baptist Church, also in Richmond. So it's clear that they took special care of her. Um, so in 1855, that's where the first record of her shows up and says she was about 14 years old, and she left Sandy Hook, New York, and went to Liberia to do missionary work. So they educated her in likely Pennsylvania somewhere, and then when she was done with her education, they sent her to Liberia to do missionary work, but she apparently wasn't happy, and they brought her back in 1860. Um, so I thought this was really interesting, just like in a general history note. In Virginia, if you took your slave to be educated, they couldn't come back to Virginia. It was against the law. Like if you educated your slave, they couldn't re-enter the state. Um, So when she did come back, like there are two news articles where they're like, Mary Jane, alias Mary Jane Henley, was arrested and jailed for 9 days for being highly educated and in Virginia, and they fined the Van Looth for allowing her to return. Um, but they don't send her anywhere. They keep her. They're allowed to keep her there. So it's kind of a weird, like, how does that law work situation? Because, like, after that, like, they just let her stay in Richmond, Virginia, even though it was against the law for her to be there. so in April 1861, she married Wilson Bowers, which is why, like, that's sort of the name. Because I guess, like, during her espionage days, that's what she went by. So that's like the popular name for her, even though it's not a name she used for very long. Um, which, um, so when I was doing my research, they got married the day, literally the day before Virginia voted to secede. So I feel like that marriage was probably for a reason. Wilson was a white man, and like it's noted in their marriage record that she was a mulatto. Um, so I thought that was probably more for protection than like an actual marriage. Because after the end of the Civil War, she doesn't use that name anymore, and he stays in Richmond, and she goes and does her own thing. So um, marriage, a marriage of sorts, I guess. So anyway, so that was her life before the Civil War, and then during the Civil War. Um, so Elizabeth Van Loo is the daughter of like Mr. and Mrs. Van Loo. The husband dies pretty early on, and he makes it really hard for the wife or anyone to free any of their slaves in his will. But the mother and Elizabeth then become involved in helping the Union during the Civil War. So some of the like quotes, because it's really hard to substantiate any sort of espionage that happened during this time because it was a secret. um, but in Elizabeth's like diaries that they found, she's a quote saying, "When I open my eyes in the morning, I say to the servant, 'What news, Mary?' And my caterer never fails. Most generally, our reliable news is gathered from Negroes, and they certainly show wisdom, discretion, and prudence." And then in another article that they did on Elizabeth later in life, like when she was like dwindling in years, and like um, she says, a maid of more than unusual intelligence. Um, and then they kind of describe like who was sent to Philadelphia and to Libya, and who was placed as a servant to the Jefferson Davis family. Um, so, like, we know that Mary was in the Jefferson Davis family, and during the Civil War, Jefferson Davis's house was the White House for was the capital basically. Like that's where everything happened at his home. Like they didn't have time to build a special building. so that's where, all of their plans and such were. Um, and then after the Civil War, like she did talks around New York and other places. And so then there are like records of her talks that she gave. And she claimed that she helped capture Confederate officers and contraband tobacco. Interesting. Super important. Not just to get the soldiers, but also the tobacco. Um, and in Fredericksburg, that she aided Union soldiers held prisoners and met with provost marshals appointed by Union officers and helped liberate. soldiers from prisons during the war. So I thought that was all like pretty interesting. So basically, you have a servant who is highly regarded um, for her intelligence, like from the beginning, from when she was 14. They obviously saw something in her that was special, or they deemed special. And then she did all this work and worked as a servant in the household and gathered information and reported it. General Ulysses S. Grant wrote um, Bet or Elizabeth Van Loo. He specifically wrote her a letter that was like, all of the information that you give us is reliable and useful. And knowing that Mary was in the Jefferson household, you can sort of assume or extrapolate that information came from her, from working in the house, which I thought was really interesting. So then post-war, she starts to work for the Freedmen Bureau as a teacher. Um, and then as like, time sort of passes, she joins like the lecture circuit, and she starts giving talks about what she did during the Civil War to help the Union. Um, and it was so one of her aliases, which I think is hilarious, is Richmona. Richmond. Like, okay. That's a name, I guess. um, and like during that speech, she says that she, freed Union soldiers from Libby Prison, which was a pretty big like camp for um, for Union soldiers in the South during the Civil War. Um, and I thought also very interesting, they note in like the articles, about her speeches, that she was very outspoken about giving blacks the right to vote. And this is still pretty recent after, being emancipated. She's like, we need the right to vote, and other injustices, and speaking about equality for blacks. One of the I thought this was just kind of funny. So one of the black newspapers published in New York describe her as very sarcastic and at times quite humorous. um, and so I thought that was pretty funny just because I find myself very sarcastic. um, so, sorry, I lost my place in my writing. Um, so she continues to like work for the Freedmen Bureau. She started a freedmen school in Georgia, and they have records of like her writing to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was run by white people who were who were educating blacks. But she like writes letters to them and it's like, I'm the only teacher here. I'm teaching 700 students during the day. I'm teaching 40 adult students at night, and I'm teaching 20 students on Sunday without like any resources and all by myself. And you don't pay me when you say you're going to. So very outspoken, just like from even like early in the days of like the emancipation, very outspoken about, what education is being what education is happening, not having enough materials and not being paid what she was told that she was going to be paid. So for all of those reasons, I found her really interesting, and it's hard to do so there's a woman who has done all this research. Her name is Lois Levine. She wrote a nonfiction book about Mary Richards and is in the process of writing like an actual biography about her. And that's where I got a lot of my information. And she has done amazing research on this woman, and it's really hard. So there are some things that were kind of amusing. And there's an article about there's a picture circulating around the internet of Mary Richards. It is not, in fact, Mary Richards. So if you were going to go out and you're like, oh, this person sounds interesting, I want to do some research on her, I would tell you if it is accompanied by a picture, it is probably not accurate. because Mary Richards, there's no photographic evidence or drawings or anything of her. There's a New York Times article about the spy whose picture fooled NPR, the US government, and me that the author wrote. So, like, it was like commonly thought that that was her, but it's not. After doing some research, Luis found out that that wasn't actually Mary Richards. So I found all of that to be really interesting. I found her life to be really interesting. Um, so there is a point where she writes to the board and says that she's married again and they're moving to the West Indies. And then after that, there's sort of no history of her. We don't know if she actually moved, if they actually got married, or if it was just like maybe she was done living in the spotlight. So I found all of those things to be like super interesting about her life and what she did in regards to being a spy. So that's all I have on her. Do you guys have any questions or comments, or is there anything maybe you'd like me to mention that or you think I might know?
I think that law about educated slave can't come back into the state is crazy. Did that happen anywhere else? I've never heard of that before.
I had never heard of it either until I looked at it, and it is something I want to look into because I thought that was really interesting. That like kind of like you can educate your slaves, but they can't come back here. It's like how does that work exactly? It's like you say this person is my property and I can do whatever I want except for educate them and then bring them back to my house. I thought that was really interesting, and I want to look into that. I'd never heard of a law like that anywhere.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting too. Anybody else? Okay, I can't see your faces, so you're gonna have to say no.
Was there something about her learning to fly?
No, that's Micah's person.
Ah, okay.
Next time.
Next time. So that's my bit about Mary Richards. Mary Richards about their espionage during the Civil War, which I think is pretty interesting to learn about. I'm sure there are others, like they mentioned other groups doing things like this, but the fact that Grant specifically wrote Elizabeth Van Loo a note to be like, you were so helpful. All of your information was so helpful and reliable, and knowing that Mary Richards was part of that group means a lot. So that's what I have. I thought she was interesting. I hope you guys learned something. Thanks for watching, and our next series is going to be on the N word, history, and is nigga okay to use? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't be a racist and wash your hands.